There we go. Hello, everyone. I'll just do a little bit of an introduction. Thank you for coming along to this webinar today on a US go-to-market strategy with our wonderful Climate Solid mentor, Janet. I'll let Janet introduce herself, but firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They were the Indigenous people of Australia, were the original climate tech innovators of our land, and we have so much to learn from their 60,000 years of caring for country. I also support an Indigenous voice to Parliament. So today is one of, I think, our final US Investment New South Wales Cleantech to the US Going Global Program webinar. And we are very lucky to have Janet here. She is a wealth of knowledge and expertise and kindness and generosity. And so I'm very excited to pass it over to the wonderful Janet Brunckhorst.
Well, thank you so much. It is honestly an honor to be here. I am going to share my screen. Can everybody see the screen with these slides? You should be able to.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Olivia and Stefan, for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm speaking to you not from Australia, but from the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people in San Francisco, and I am going to be chatting about entering the US market really from a product perspective because I'm a product person. So I've been a product leader for quite a long time. I've been living in San Francisco since 2011. And most recently, currently I'm a bit of a dilettante, but I was most recently the director of product at Aurora Solar for their sales tools. I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of the Climate Salad community and hopefully just supporting some Aussie startups with the things I've learned working with startups, scaling companies, and enterprises in the US over the past 12-ish years. So with that said, we can jump in. So you wanna be in America, and you've heard this before. You will hear it again. It is a really big place, and I know you all know that. So you need to get specific on your market. So as we're talking through, that's kind of the place where I'll start. But I have a couple of stats. America has about 13 times as many people as Australia does, which when I looked it up, kind of blew my mind. And there are huge cultural and economic differences across the country. Again, I know you all know this, but broadly speaking, usually you're thinking about the East Coast, the West Coast, the South, and the middle, with a couple of really important outliers. One of them is Texas. Texas is big, and Texas is different. That's why they call themselves the Lone Star State. And of course, California, the fifth largest economy, might be the fourth largest economy right now. It's certainly headed that direction in the world. So there are a couple of these really big markets that you kind of want to treat differently. That's my kind of caveat to going to America. So because I'm a product manager, I ask a lot of questions. So as I go through today, it's sort of less workshop and more talk shop, but I'll try to make it a bit participatory. But really, I want to ask a series of questions, and I can't answer them because I don't know anything about your businesses, or very little if I'm lucky enough to know anything at all. You know all about your businesses, so you will be able to answer those questions, but probably not today. So I think that today will generate more questions, and that's kind of the idea. And because I'm a product manager, I incessantly ask this question, why? So in today's case, why this market, why now, and why you are the big questions. And of course, from a product perspective, this always comes down to what's the problem that you're solving and who are you solving it for? I know there was a great session yesterday. If you missed it, there's a recording with Claire Muller about finding your best customers. So we're going to do like a much scrappier version of a sort of ideal customer. I'm not going to call it an exercise, really, just a thinking about your ideal customers right now. You've probably done this before, which is awesome, but let's just take a few minutes to think about this topic together. So I'd love for you to spend like just a minute jotting down some ideal customer characteristics. So this is just a set of questions about what some of those characteristics might be. Of course, the problem you're solving, but also their pain points, some things about the structure of their business, what it looks like, and the outcomes that you want to drive. So thinking about your most successful customers, the customers that are successful because of the way they use your product and who use your product the most successfully. Just I'll give you a minute. I'll be quiet, I promise, to just think that through and maybe jot down a couple things. Here it is in table form. Did everybody kind of jot something down?
Mentally, yes.
Spaces. Mentally jotted. I love it. I'll give an example as well. When I was working in Aurora, our ideal customer was enterprise solar installers, and as we did customer research, some really interesting things came up. In particular, that we noticed that enterprise solar installers, which that's not a very large group of customers. There aren't that many of them, these really big installers, but there were some really key differences that made a huge difference. So those who were working across multiple territories and using a channel partner business model had really different pain points and needs from our product compared to a vertically integrated installer working maybe in a single territory or a more cohesive territory, and who had their own sales team. Was particularly relevant for me working on the sales tools. So thinking about those ideal customers, we actually had to rethink that as we realized actually this is not it's not one big group, and there are actually very important differences between them. So the reason this is important when you're thinking about a new market is, of course, because these things might not look the same when you think about those ideal customers in the US context. So I've kind of just put a set of questions here about, do those problems look the same when you get here? Are their pain points the same? I think size is a really interesting one. If you're in a market like Australia that's much smaller, and I don't know the answer to this, but I'm really curious, the customers that have the problem that you solve or the behaviors that make them successful, are those similar sized customers in the US? Are they a different size of customer? I don't know the answer, but I think it's probably important to figure those kinds of things out. So I made these tables these are just containers. This is not a framework, but I like containers because it means you have a place to put things, and then put them into your framework later on, whether it's jobs to be done or business model, canvas, or whatever it is that you're using. So I'm curious, as you look at this and you think about those pain points and behaviors and characteristics of your ideal customer, does anyone have a sense now that, oh yes, I know one of these things is the same in the US? Anyone want to throw out an example?
Yeah, for me, my feel is that for our ideal customer, pretty much everything is the same, except for maybe behaviors. I'm just not super familiar with our customers, which are pretty much large energy users with a roof or some land. The customer problem, I think, is the same. Pain points are the same. Size of the company, industry, business model, goals of drivers. I think all those things are the same. But yeah, I'm not sure about behaviors yet. There could be some differences in how they do things there.
Awesome. And Ross, I saw you put your hand up as well. Hi.
Hello, we were talking earlier. Yeah, I think so. Basically, the problem we're trying to identify, the target customer is the energy retailers who need to transform their business model from wholesale fossil fuels to more virtual power plants. And a very similar market in the US is Texas, which is an isolated grid, has big volatility. I was looking at OpenNem this morning, and there was negative pricing at 8:30 in the morning in New South Wales. So we've got huge problems, and Texas faces the same issue. So, like Andrew said, behavior is probably different, but there's a lot of companies in Texas in the energy market that are global. So I think it's probably a market that's well suited for us.
Love it. And is there anything, you just show of hands or jump in, is there anything that you look at on here? Actually, Andrew mentioned one, and you go, actually, I don't know. I have no idea if it's the same or different in the US. Behaviors for Andrew. Anyone else have that moment? No. Great. Well, the good news is that anything here that you can't answer, so for Andrew, that behaviors question is an excellent target for research. And anything that you can answer on here is an excellent target for research, because you'll want to validate that those things that you think are the same are actually the same. And that means that as you start having customer conversations in the US, or as you continue, because I know some of you are already wading into that, everything kind of becomes research. Every conversation you have with a customer is a chance to learn. And I actually made another set of containers that are on the next slide, where you could just jot down your main 3 questions. So maybe Andrew writes down something about the behaviors that are indicative of successful customers in current markets, and what question there is about those, and just have them in mind anytime you talk to a customer. Because while you're, from a sales perspective, the goal of those conversations is going to be to listen and hear the problems, and then say, well, hey, this is how we solve those problems. You can also be listening at the same time for the things that you need to learn about the whole market. And I think that's, it's really powerful. And there are just so many people, so many companies here that you can get a lot of research done that way. I just want to touch on as well something I've talked to a few people about, including Stefan and I actually talked about this. Directness, you may have noticed if you've talked to folks in America, it's a thing here, much more so than in Australia. And that is actually fantastic, because people don't mind you asking direct questions. If you want to know something, you can just ask them. And that will not faze people at all. Like, they probably won't even notice that you did that thing, even though maybe it feels uncomfortable for you. And you can also be really direct about presenting yourself and your company and your solution, especially if you're able to very closely map it to their problem. If people are able to see you're reflecting back, oh, this is the problem you said you had, here's the way we solve that specific problem, and we do it really well. We do it the best. You're allowed to say you're the best. I think this is something that can be a little culturally difficult for us Aussies, but it's completely fine to do here. All right, so I'm going to skip over these containers because we talked about them. I put them all at the end in the resources section as well. So as you're, I have these little how-to sections throughout. So as you've figured out who exactly your ideal customer in the market is, including the roles that you want to talk to, again, being direct, reaching out on LinkedIn is completely fine to do. And people they won't always respond, but a lot of them will respond. I believe that Mick has really good advice on cold outreach. So if you haven't heard his talk on this topic, then definitely hit him up. The other thing that has really surprised me, and I don't know if it will surprise you, but social media groups are really a good way to do customer research in the US. And surprisingly, to me at least, Facebook is a place where people hang out in their like professional affinity groups. Facebook groups are quite powerful. For the solar industry, I know there were whole groups that were just solar sales reps talking shop. So for folks at Aurora, like, they would just go lurk and see what they were saying about their sales tools. And they would, I know it sounds kind of unbelievable, but they would literally talk about, like, they would trash talk like some feature in their sales tool and compare it with something they used at their old company. And it was gold for customer research. So definitely trying to dig up those is really helpful. And a lot of companies are going to be trying to establish themselves as thought leaders as well. So going to your ideal customer, figuring out who thinks of themselves in that way in the industry. Maybe it's a big company, maybe it's like startups who are trying to change things, but they might be creating content that will give you real insights into how those companies think about themselves and want to be perceived. So those are my hot tips, and I have links at the end of the document with more resources on this. So I'll just pause for a second because I've been talking a lot, and we're going to move on to the how section now, and I'll ask you a bunch more questions. Does anyone have any questions or anything you want to bring up at this point?
No, nothing from me.
No. Then we will proceed to how. So you may notice on this slide, the questions there, they might look familiar if you're paying attention, because the same questions that you ask about your customers, you can also ask about your own business when thinking about how you're going to do this. So you've got this really solid why, you know what problem you're solving and you know who you're solving it for. And now you need to know what levers you can pull to drive your success, and by turn, the success of your customers. This is the section that is going to generate, hopefully, the most questions. I am not an expert. I'm maybe an expert on one of the topics that I will touch on in here. And I'm absolutely not an expert on any of the rest. But I think that talking about this can generate more questions that you can take forward into your mentoring conversations, into your customer conversations, and hopefully will help you to generate the next set of questions and the next set of questions, and they'll be productive questioning. Another bucket of containers. We won't pause to do this now, just in the interest of time. I want to make sure you've got plenty of time for questions at the end. But I think it's worth taking that moment, if you haven't done this already as part of your strategy work, to just describe your own company to yourself. Take a moment to write down what these characteristics of your success are. And you can use those in multiple ways, including to think about how will I translate that success into a new market. So the levers that we're going to talk about today, it's so relieving also to be able to call them levers and not levers. So thank you for that. So these levers, I want to touch on channels, team and structure, tailwinds, and briefly on funding. I think that you've had or will have some sessions as well that are more specific about at least IRA and funding. So I'll just touch on those really briefly. But let's talk about channels for a minute. I'm assuming that all of you are deeply embedded in the Australian market and maybe in some other international markets closer to home. Is that true?
Yeah, just Australia for us.
Just Australia. Yeah, lots of nodding. Mostly Australia. Okay. So obviously it's a much smaller market. And as I was thinking this through, I was thinking, well, what's one big thing that probably is different? And I think the channels that you use is a big area where you may need to change things up. Your product maybe is the same, but the channels you use to sell it potentially are going to be really different. And we could dig into talking about any of these. I'm not a go-to-market person. I'm a product person. But I wanted to pick on leads for a second because, and I didn't lump them in with marketing because I do think that leads are potentially their own kind of separate topic. So thinking about how you get leads today versus how you'll get them in the US, I think is probably important for a lot of businesses, if not for yours specifically. So leads may be more expensive, they may be cheaper in the US. Solar leads, for example, are crazy expensive in the US and are a big contributor to the soft costs of solar. And the soft costs of solar make it 3 to 4 times more expensive installed as in Australia, which is a little bit nuts. So thinking about how, like, what that lead acquisition looks like, whether you'll be able to do it in the same way, I think it is a really important consideration. And you can ask the same types of questions around marketing and sales channels as well. Are my keywords going to be really expensive, or can I not rely on word of mouth and actually I have to do lots more keyword advertising? I don't know, I'm not a marketer. But these types of questions I think are really important. So we have time for this, I think. If you are willing and would like to, maybe just take a second to jot down what your primary and secondary channels are for any one of these or all of them, if you like. Just to kind of have them out there in a place written down so that you remember, oh yeah, I gotta think about whether that's the same. I'll just give you a minute to do that.
Janet, do you want us to write down this for our current markets or for the US or both?
For the current market, I mean both if you already know. Yeah. I only have the little people on the side, so I can't see all of your ones. All right. Does anybody want to share any of their current channels, especially if you think that they'll change or you're not sure?
Yeah,
I can.
Oh, go on. Do you want to go, Andrew, or do you want me to go?
Go ahead, Neil.
Okay. So I think we kind of treat leads and kind of marketing as part of marketing. So I think for Australia, primarily we get them through LinkedIn and through our webinar program. And then in the US, we are really leaning into SEO and looking to kind of leverage that at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Nice. How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, for us, leads and marketing is essentially existing networks and introductions. We can rely on that a little bit in the US through some of the some of the international companies we work with Australia, with American offices. In terms of sales, that's all through channel partners. We use brokers and consultants. Where we think that is going to be the same in the US, so we're going to target them fairly heavily in the US.
Nice. Love it. So one of the things I think is, I'm going to talk about partnerships in a second. One of the things that I think is really great to do in the US, because there are just so many companies here, so many businesses doing so many things. If you have a hypothesis around, oh, this is how we're going to get our leads, or this is how we're going to build our channels, there's probably somebody else doing something similar. And it's a really awesome idea to leverage their work and copy them. I don't mean copy them in in an inappropriate way, but it doesn't have to necessarily be someone in your industry or with a product that's exactly like yours, but there are so many kind of similar or analogous business models that leveraging somebody else's work as a shortcut, I think is awesome. It's another type of container just to put things in. And I think I've written this on multiple slides at this point, but making hypotheses, testing, measuring, this is something that I'm sure is deeply ingrained in all of you as founders, and you can apply it everywhere, and I reckon you should. Everything that you do in order to make sure that it's as effective as it can possibly be. If you just have this kind of test and learn or build, measure, learn, whatever you like to call the framework, if you have that framework in your head all of the time, then it means that you're never kind of chasing after a strategy or an approach that ends up being wasted, because you know why you're doing it, you know what results you expect to see, and when you don't see that results, or if you don't see those results, then you stop doing it and you do something different. So I definitely encourage kind of having that all the time. And just coming back to partners, this is another cultural thing, which is why I wanted to sort of pause on it for a second. I wrote here, don't be afraid of frenemies. I think in this sort of, often it's a crowded market here in the US. And because people are very direct, because people are very willing to kind of share and introduce and all of those kinds of things, you'll often find that potential competitors are also potential partners, or maybe you can't quite tell which one they are. And a lot of the time it can be kind of uncomfortable. I know as an Australian, I've definitely had some uncomfortable moments from like, why are these people asking us to do this? I don't know. This project feels really risky because aren't they just going to become a competitor? And that's sometimes a real risk. And I'm definitely not discounting it. But I think where I've come to with this is to assume that everyone's acting with integrity, and that everyone's acting with their own business interests in mind. If they're willing to share, well, they're sharing with their business interests in mind as well. And if you also act with integrity and with your own business interests in mind, it's probably an okay place to be. And you may end up in a partnership with a competitor, and that might be, there might be some mutualism there. And you may decide later that that mutualism is over and you're going to go your separate ways. But I think it's a bit of a challenging thing to sort of culturally get your head around sometimes. But definitely, there's a lot of mutualism, I think, happens. And of course, always come back to your why in any of these things. If you've got a strong why, then the how falls into place much more easily. All right, I'm going to move on to talking about team and structure, because once you've got those channels in place, then of course you need the people who are going to do those things in this new market. And perhaps that is the exact same team as you already have, and you can manage that with the existing team, and that's awesome. And perhaps that's not the case. These are big and gnarly questions, and they have no right answer. There is never a right answer to org design. It's also my absolute favorite thing to talk about, so I'm going to keep it brief. But if you ever want to chat about teams, then hit me up. The main thing that I guess I want to say to you all, and for you all to take away, is that it's okay not to know the answers to this, or really to anything about going into a new market. It's okay. How would you know? You haven't done it yet. But as you're thinking through this stuff, I think as leaders, it's really easy for us to fall into that trap of thinking, well, I have to have the answer and I have to be the expert. Because I have to lead this team into a new market, and this is scary and uncertain. And if I don't know the answer, then who does? So I don't know if anybody has felt this way ever. I see Andrew raise his eyebrows. Yeah.
That was my daughter who's painting her hand, but no, I definitely feel that way 99% of the time.
Yeah. And it's scary, and it's also okay, because you don't have to be the expert in everything. That's why you have a team. And when you think about who knows the answers to these questions, it might even be your team. They might actually know. So the way I like to kind of think this through, again, I put it in a table of containers. You can put it in whatever kind of containers you like. But as you're thinking about new market, right now, the only hows that we've talked about are go-to-market hows. We're not talking about product hows at all. So when you think about these go-to-market motions, whatever you've decided is the right thing for you, how you're going to get your leads and do your marketing and get your sales, write down the activities or have them in your head. But if you write them down, then they're in front of you. You can share them. What activities do you think that people are going to have to do? Someone is going to have to do. Can the team today do them? Or is there a delta and you need something to change? Maybe you train someone on your team. Maybe they need to be in a different location, and it's not to do with skills, it's just to do with where. Maybe you actually need to hire people locally. But doing a kind of simple sort of audit of what needs to be done and who's going to do it, I think can be really powerful. This seems like such a simple suggestion, but I think it's really easy to overlook this kind of really basic stuff when there's so much to do because you're doing something as huge as going into a new market. I'm not going to make you do this right now. But as you think through that, of course, you've got research to back you up, and you know what really successful companies who are doing something similar are doing, and you can see what team they have by looking at it on LinkedIn probably, or maybe they even publish an org chart, which would be cool. So there are bits of desk research that you can do that can kind of help you understand, oh, what team am I going to need, and what is that team going to need from me or from a leader? Like I said, asking your existing team can really help, especially once you've broken it. If you ask your team, how should we go to market in the US? Maybe they don't know the answer to that question. But if you go to your team and say, hey, I want to do this kind of SEO, what sort of role can you do that? Do you have those skills? Who has those skills? Then that's a question that the team can probably get their heads around, depending on your team and how big your team is. And of course, you have mentors, people who are doing this already in the US that you can reach out to. The more conversations you have, the more people you'll have to ask questions like these to. You can add them to your top 3 questions you want to know the answers to. And no surprises. I personally believe you should develop a hypothesis and then test it. So if you say, I have to have sales reps on the ground in the US, you can test that hypothesis by hiring, I don't know, maybe it's one sales rep on the ground in the US, and maybe they're a contractor, and see if you actually achieve the numbers that you thought you were going to do, because you definitely write down that exact number as part of your experiment plan. And if you don't hit those numbers, well, then you can think about, oh, why? I thought that I could do this. And then you just keep doing that until you dominate the world. That's how that works.
Yeah, I just want to cut in here.
Right.
I spent a few years at AWS as a startup advisor. So I was coaching some of the larger scale ups that run on AWS, and a theme that I heard over and over from Aussie founders was their US expansion strategy was simply, I hire Schmick VP of sales in the States. They hire some folks that they know, they go to market and they get me sales. And I said, well, I think you should put some more thinking into that and do some more testing, just as Janet outlined. And invariably, I'd come back later, 6 months, a year later, and they will have let that team go and said, oh, it was a dismal failure. They didn't generate any sales because they didn't start off asking the questions and with a hypothesis. They just went straight to hiring as my international expansion strategy. Now, there's another story of a Australian founder that has recently just had a very material exit, and his US expansion strategy was initially to get up at 1 a.m. and start calling people in the US and just basically go outbound. That's Service Rocket, and Rob has just recently exited that company for a big material gain. So he tested and tested and tested, and he eventually set up operations there and had a US footprint before that exit. So, really 2 different styles. I completely echo what Janet said, which is hiring isn't a strategy. You're going to start with a strategy first and then hire into that strategy, potentially, if that makes sense. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Yeah, especially hiring the most expensive person first. It seems like it's the opposite of lean startup principles, really. Yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing that in that story that you told, Stefan, is that what he did was he did the thing that doesn't scale. Now, no one's ever going to say, oh, the answer to this as I grow my company is I'll get up at 1 a.m. forever and do all the sales calls myself. But doing the thing that doesn't scale is also doing it really inexpensively and testing and learning in the cheapest way you can. So I love that story. That's awesome. All right. I think we're okay for time. Let's talk about tailwinds. In some ways, I'm like, oh, maybe folks expect to kind of start with this, like, what's going on in the US? What the heck is up with IRA? And how can I get in on some of that IRA goodness? And the reason that I put this so far down is because if you don't have a clear why, and you don't know how for your business you need to go about this, then IRA is just a massive distraction. However, it's also really the most remarkable and powerful piece of legislation. I was at a conference last year, and there were solar CEOs who were so excited because it was the first time during their time in solar, which for some of them was their whole careers, that they'd ever felt tailwinds. And they'd always felt like they were up against these headwinds, and they were, at the mercy of the solar coaster. And suddenly they're like, we have tailwinds in our industry, and they were really, really buoyant. And that feeling of excitement hasn't gone away, even though things are a little weird right now, especially in Texas, Ross. But as all of you are in the business of solving a problem, no one here is in the business of chasing incentives. There are some finance people who are in the business of chasing incentives, and that is literally their business model. But for the rest of us, we're going to solve problems with products, and maybe there's also some kind of incentive or regulatory program or something that is designed to solve the same problem that we're solving. And that's awesome because we can take advantage of that in one way or another. So Uncle IRA, as Renew Economy dubbed it recently, we call it IRA, not the IRA in the US. That's a thing to know. I think if you haven't already had the talk on it, there's going to be a talk that's much more specific and detailed. And I am definitely not an expert on IRA. I haven't even read the whole guidebook. I've put a link to the White House's 140-page guidebook in the notes at the end. But IRA is, it's important, I think, to understand that it came through the budget process. So it's only things that are part of the budget that are in it, payouts and taxes. It doesn't have standards or mandates or targets or anything like that. Of course, anything political can be undone by political means. So IRA's here, and it's delivering tons of value, and it could go away. Let's hope that doesn't, but it could. I'll also just mention that the ITC, which has been folded into IRA but predates it by a long time, more than a decade, the income tax credit program has driven more solar adoption in the US than anything else. And it's been increased and extended as part of IRA. So that's rad. But IRA is not the only game in town. There is no good centralized resource to find incentives programs in the US. So the image is from a database called Desire. I've put the link in the end. It is a manually updated database, which really, it hurts me. But as you can see, like Minnesota has 130 some policies and incentives, and you can go find them in Desire, and maybe some of them have expired. But that's one state. I picked a random state. There are incentives at the utility level and the state level across the country, and some of them are super specific, and some of them are pretty broad. And so going hunting for incentives before you've really gotten clear on your market is probably a bit of a fool's errand. Once you're clear on your market, then you might want to go and research, what NYSERDA is up to, or what the CPUC has for you in California. And then the other piece here is, of course, different places have different environmental and cultural and political factors at play. So understanding that, I think, is really important. And I want to, in addition to the kind of environmental stuff, that means, for example, there's tons of solar in California, which you may know is a lefty paradise, super progressive, except for the parts that aren't. Hawaii, Texas, and Florida, politically, there's quite a spectrum there. Tons of renewables in all of those places. Also, lots of natural disasters, sunlight, and extremes of fire, heat, and or cold. So, the things that link up these places are variable. I wanted to kind of share a little bit about the solar narratives. Obviously, solar is just one thing. It just happens to be the thing that I've worked in. But I think it's instructive because of the difference in the kind of sales narratives and the reasons we saw in different places. So everyone wants to go solar to save money. That's the same anywhere you go. Some of our customers would tell us, oh, people only care about energy independence. That's what people in this region, in this pocket of the country care about. And they might care about energy independence because they hate the utility company and they think they're gouging and they want to stop giving their money to the utility company. They might care about the energy independence of the United States. And it might be, solar might be an expression of their patriotism, that they're saying we should be able to generate our own power in our own great country. And those people are going to only be buying American-made solar panels. So these really, even within this kind of people want energy independence, there are these different narratives that might flow through it. Most of these folks are not in the compound trying to get all the way off the grid, but they have reasons that they want more energy independence for themselves, their household, their business, and the nation. And environment would always come at the kind of the bottom of the list. People who want to go solar just for environmental reasons were really few and far between. If it didn't save them money, they weren't going to do it. All right. What slide am I even on? Oh, I see. Okay. So of course there are also challenges, and actually Ross touched on some of these in Texas specifically earlier. But one company's headwinds might be another company's tailwinds, because if you're solving problems like the fact that the grids are a total mess, or your product can help speed up permitting for some reason, then these challenges are actually your opportunity. But being aware of these things, you know, if what you want to do is dependent on people being able to get very large scale solar projects interconnected, then that could be a real challenge, a real problem for your business, because interconnection is so backlogged. I can't get through a presentation without at least one 2x2. I'm not going to dwell on this one, but I think as we were talking about, like, not chasing incentives, and you could apply this to partnerships as well, like being really aware of this kind of alignment versus value matrix. I love doing things like this and just taking that moment to pause and saying, okay, this seems like a great opportunity. Like, I could take advantage of this amazing incentives program and it's $1 bajillion. But if it's not aligned with my problem, then it's a distraction. Or if this partnership is actually not going to deliver the value, even though they're like super simpatico and values aligned with us, then, or maybe they just have a giant brand and it seems amazing. If it's not actually aligned with what I'm trying to do, then it's a distraction. So I wanted to kind of throw that one in there. And again, all these little templates are at the end. So with starting with this one, I think I don't have a ton to kind of add to what I said already, but leaning into that research, understanding the problems that your customers have, how these incentives are relevant, not just to you, but also to them. What other factors might be at play really helps with having those customer conversations, including sales conversations, with real empathy, and knowing what's going on for them and for you. I'm going to motor through this section because we don't have a ton of time left. But I know some of you might be looking for funding in the US. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm not an expert on this, and I think you have other experts to talk to about this topic. But just a few observations as you're kind of going out there looking for funding. VC playbooks are not really any different. There is quite a lot of VC focused on climate these days and focused on climate tech. And one thing I've seen is that there are companies with pretty specific thesis in their climate tech investing. So if you can align yourself with a specific thesis, that can help you to winnow down like the huge sea of climate tech firms, climate tech VC firms. I know there's some debt financing, like Tractor Ventures doing revenue based financing in Australia. There's a there seems to be a bit more of that and a bit more of these kind of alternative ways to structure financing happening in the US. Enduring Planet is the big climate tech revenue-based financing company. So, and I think they spoke at Climate Salad. Dimitri, I think, spoke at Climate Salad a couple of months ago, maybe. So that might be another area to target. There are other firms that are doing debt financing as part of their offering as well, or structured finance as part of their offering. And the final one I wanted to mention, I don't know how this is playing out in Australia, but crowdfunding has become quite, it seems like it's kind of on the upswing. So retail investors can invest in startups, in securities through it has to be through a platform or a broker, which has to be registered with the SEC and a member of FINRA and all of the things. But there are a couple of specific climate focused crowdfunding platforms that startups can list on, and then there are others that are more generic. But that climate tech startups are definitely getting onto those crowdfunding platforms. And getting into investor communities, I think, is potentially another good way. So there are lots of Slack communities that have, I'm in one that's specifically about climate investing, but some of the climate communities also have investing channels. And just seeing what people are talking about, what platforms they're using, what events they're going to, things like that, I think can be really helpful just to get the lay of the land, and, potentially, meet potential investors or see who those investors are talking to or listening to as well, because there's just so many funds out here. Before I move on to the what, does anybody have any questions about that whole section that you want to bring up now before we move on? No? Excellent. I feel like I'm failing in my generate more questions. Hopefully you have questions in your heads. So the last area that I really wanted to talk about is the what. And this is the easiest one, right? The why is hard because you've got to figure out your customer. And then the how is probably even harder once you get into those details. But the what is just your product. And hopefully at the end of doing this work, you come to your product and you say, yeah, this is still the thing I need to sell. And if that's not the case, sometimes, when you get clear on that why and how, you might find there are things that need to be tweaked about your product. But as long as you're tweaking it to solve the same why, and not building a whole new thing that is actually to solve a whole different problem, because now you're running two ventures at the same time, and that just seems really tiring, then it's okay if you get to this point and think, okay, I actually need to make some product changes. If you started making product changes without doing that upfront work, you run the risk of becoming a little unmoored. Anyway, these are things you already know. I think one example might be helpful to share an example here. I think a place where this will often show up is in onboarding flows, for example. You might go into a new market, and the way that, for whatever reason, the customers that you need to reach in that new market might need to onboard differently. It might be because you have no self-service flow and they expect a self-service flow, or the size of company means that you need to make that self-service flow work better. Or it might be something more regulatory. You need to collect different types of data right up front, or you need to not collect certain types of data right up front, depending on privacy regulations. These are the kinds of things that I think really often will show up in new markets, is like, when I have sold this product and people need to get into it, how do people in this market do that? And the other one that I know will come up for some of you at least is things like, how do I change the way I model things because there's just something that's technically different or structurally different. Texas energy, like Texas tariffs, for example, don't look like most other tariffs. So if you have a software product that relies on modeling anything to do with tariffs, then you might need to take into account that the Texas tariff is going to be structured differently, just to get into a super nerdy example. But these are the kinds of tactical things that will change in the what, rather than, wholesale changes to your product, with any luck. As I mentioned, I've included a bunch of resources at the end of this slide deck that hopefully will be useful to you. And that is all the questions that I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time. And just to reiterate that if you ever want to reach out to me, you are more than welcome to on Slack or on email. I'm happy to ask you more questions.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was incredible, and I'm sure there are lots of questions, and I know you've been reaching out to a few founders individually for those individual sessions too. We've got a couple of minutes left. Did anyone have any other questions for Janet, or did she do such a good job that we've solved all your go-to-market questions and strategies?
I've got about 100 specific questions, so I think I might talk to Janet out of this forum.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you,
Janet. I love it.
That was excellent.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ross. Oh, you're so welcome. I'm happy to hear you have 100 questions, Andrew. That is the correct number.
Awesome. Is anybody going to Verge with us in October? Because we'll get to see Janet in real life in San Jose in October, hopefully, assuming that COVID doesn't splash over and bring everything to a screeching halt again.
No, I won't be, unfortunately.
Cool. We'll definitely follow up with Janet. I'm always happy. So, full disclosure, I was an American. Now I'm an Australian. I've been here 10 years, but I've kind of specialized in helping businesses get into international markets. And I do believe that I still understand the psyche of how to do business over there and the mindset. So ping me as well. Happy to chat with anybody. And you can bounce, ideas off me and go to market strategies. That's my jam. So thanks, Janet. Really amazing. Thank you. You're so generous with your time. Really appreciate it.
You are so welcome. It's honestly a privilege.
And I hope you test negative soon.
Me too. I want to get out of this room, team.
Well, wonderful. With that, I might stop this recording.